Welcome to another new video. Deep in the hollows of eastern Kentucky, where morning mist hangs like grief you can't shake, and the silence presses down heavier than any sound ever could, there lived a family whose own blood turned against them. This is the story of Martha May Collier, a woman whose body became a graveyard for her own children, each one arriving into this world already carrying death in their bones. The year was 1947. The rest of America had moved on from war. But up in those Appalachian valleys, time had a different rhythm. It barely moved at all. The Collier family had roots in that same hollow stretching back 5 generations. They kept to themselves by choice, and the mountains kept them that way by force. The closest town, Harland, sat 23 miles off, connected by roads so treacherous they might as well have been on the moon come winter. The Colliers didn't need the outside world anyway. Their land gave them everything: a creek for water, fields for food, and each other for company. That was enough. It had to be. Martha May came into this world in 1929, the youngest of Ezekiel and Sarah Collier's 7 children. Only 4 of those 7 made it past babyhood. Even then, the pattern was already writing itself. Growing up, Martha May knew nothing but the mountain and the family. They had their own way of speaking, a strange blend of Old English words and sounds they'd made up themselves, something outsiders couldn't make heads or tails of. No schoolhouse ever saw these children. No doctor ever examined them. Just the hollow, just each other, day after day after day. When Martha May turned 16 in 1945, her father made arrangements. She would marry her first cousin, Thomas Collier. This wasn't strange in the hollow. The Colliers had been marrying kin for generations. Ezekiel himself had taken his uncle's daughter as his wife, and his own father before him had married his niece. The family tree had long since stopped reaching outward. Instead, it had twisted back on itself, roots tangling with branches until you couldn't tell where one ended and another began. Just the same names, the same blood, circling around and around. Thomas was 24. Quiet, he walked with a bad limp, and his eyes sat too wide on his narrow face. A cleft palate made his speech muddy and hard to follow. His hands never stopped shaking, a trembling that got worse as he got older. In the Collier family, these weren't warning signs. They were just family traits. The way things were, they made their home in a cabin Thomas's grandfather had built. A leaning, tired structure that let the cold sneak in through 100 gaps. The furniture was rough-hewn, functional but plain. A single fireplace did double duty for heat and cooking. No electricity. No running water. The outside world might as well have been a dream. Sometimes Thomas would go to town to trade, but those trips were rare. Mostly, they stayed put. Martha May found herself pregnant in the spring of 1946. 17 years old. At first, things moved along normal enough, though the sickness hit her hard. Weeks of nausea so bad, she could barely lift her head from the pillow. Her mother Sarah tended her with mountain remedies. Roots brewed into teas, poultices spread across her swelling belly, prayers whispered into the darkness like seeds planted in poor soil. January 1947. 36 hours of labor. No doctor. Just Sarah and Thomas's mother, Rebecca, catching the baby when he finally came. When that child slid into the world, both women fell silent. A boy. They named him Ezekiel Jenner. He was alive but God. His head, misshapen, flattened on one side and pulled long, his eyes bulging from their sockets like they were trying to escape, unable to close all the way. His arms bent wrong, bones curved where they should have been straight. His skin had a grayish tint, like life was already draining out of him through some invisible wound. He never cried. Just breathed in those shallow, desperate gasps, his tiny chest heaving with effort it could never sustain. Martha May held him for 3 days, watched him fade by inches. He never nursed, never made a sound. On the fourth day, the breathing stopped. They buried him behind the cabin in ground, so frozen they could barely scratch out a grave. Within months, Martha May was pregnant again. Summer 1947 brought another baby, and by spring of 1948 she delivered. A girl this time named Sarah after her grandmother. Little Sarah came with her own catalogue of wrongness. Her spine curved savage, a hump rising on her back that made her look broken from the start. One leg shorter than the other, ending in a twisted club foot. Her jaw jutted forward so her mouth couldn't close proper, drool always leaking. But Sarah lived. She grew, after a fashion, though she never reached any of the milestones even the isolated Colliers knew to expect. 6 months, couldn't lift her head. A year, still couldn't sit. Her eyes would track movement, so something was working in there, but she never smiled, never cooed, never made those baby sounds that signal a soul waking up. She just existed, breathing, eating, never truly living. They loved her anyway. Martha May spent hours each day feeding Sarah, with a cloth soaked in milk, because the child couldn't coordinate suckling. Thomas carved a special cradle that cradled her twisted spine. They loved her like people love something broken that they feel bound to protect. 1949. A third pregnancy. A pattern was locking into place, though nobody had the knowledge to read the warning signs. Early 1950 brought another boy, Thomas Jr. His head arrived too big for his body, swollen with fluid that stretched his skull grotesque. Fluid pressure pushed his eyes to the sides of his head. The soft spots never closed. His skin stretched thin over that ballooning skull, veins showing through like a roadmap of suffering. Thomas Jr. lasted 2 weeks. His breathing labored from the start, seizures contorting his small body, back arching until it seemed his spine would snap. Martha May held him through every one, tears running down her face, praying to a God she'd been taught cared about even the least of his creatures. When he died, something inside Martha May cracked. She was 21 years old. 2 children buried. 1 more trapped in a body that would never grow. The mountain women whispered she was cursed, that death rode in her womb. But the truth was simpler and more terrible. Mathematics. Genetics, the cold arithmetic of blood. By 1951, Martha May had given birth 6 times. 3 children in the ground. Sarah, now 3, still infant-sized, frozen in time and development. 2 more had come in between, each carrying their own burdens. Jacob, born late 1950, survived infancy but arrived blind from cataracts, his ears malformed and low, set, hearing reduced to muffled shadows of sound. Worst of all, his jaw hadn't formed right. His mouth could barely open, turning every feeding into an agony of patience and effort. Rebecca, named for Thomas's mother, came in 1951 with her insides showing through a gap in her belly wall. The skin hadn't closed during development, leaving loops of intestine exposed. The midwives did what they could. Cloth soaked in whiskey pressed against the opening, hoping to fight off infection. But within days, the cabin filled with a smell you can't forget. Rot. Death moving in. Rebecca lasted 11 days before infection and shock took her. Martha May's body was crumbling. Each pregnancy stripped more from her. Her teeth loosened and fell. Her hair thinned to patches. Dark circles carved permanent hollows under her eyes. She was 22 and looked 40. The mountain had aged her, or maybe the children had, each one taking a piece of her youth, her health, her hope. Thomas watched his wife fade with a helpless frustration that sometimes curdled into anger. He worked the fields dawn to dark, trying to feed his household of broken children. His own health was sliding too, the tremor in his hands spreading to his arms and legs, his walk turning to a shuffle, his speech decaying into near unintelligibility as facial muscles weakened. Other families started avoiding the Colliers. When Martha May made rare trips to town, people crossed the street. They saw her children, the ones still alive, and recognized something fundamentally wrong, though they lacked words for it. Mountain folk, prone to believing in curses and divine punishment. What sin must the Colliers have committed, they wondered, to deserve such visible evidence of God's displeasure? But no God was punishing the Colliers, just biology. The cold equations that don't care about love or intention. Every human carries recessive genes. Mutations that stay harmless when paired with a normal copy from the other parent. But when close relatives reproduce, the odds of two harmful copies finding each other skyrocket. 5 generations of cousin marriages had squeezed the Collier bloodline through an ever-narrowing bottleneck. The same damaged genes circled and recircled, appearing and reappearing with increasing frequency. With each generation, genetic diversity shrank. With each cousin marriage, the chance of devastating combinations grew. Martha May and Thomas weren't just first cousins. They were the product of generations of intermarriage. Their genetic similarity ran so deep that their children inherited matched pairs of mutated genes, affecting bone development, neural formation, connective tissue, countless biological systems all compromised. Winter 1952, 7th pregnancy. Martha May was 23. By now, she'd stopped hoping for a healthy child. She just endured, moving through days in a fog of exhaustion and resignation. Thomas had stopped touching her with anything resembling tenderness. Their couplings had become grim duty, performed in silence and darkness. The pregnancy went wrong from the start. Bleeding through the first trimester. Her belly swelling too large. Strange movements inside. Not the normal kicks and rolls, but irregular thumps that felt wrong. Sarah prepared her remedies and said her prayers, but even she seemed to have lost faith. August 1952, premature labor. Quick and violent birth, another boy, stillborn. His body covered in thick dark hair from head to toe. A condition called hypertrichosis that gave him an almost animal appearance. His spine exposed along his back, vertebrae visible through a gap in the skin. Internal organs malformed. Kidneys fused together. Lungs never fully formed. They buried him that same day. Another wooden cross in the growing cemetery. Martha May didn't attend. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, body empty, mind numb. She'd begun to understand, in some wordless way that transcended formal knowledge, that her womb had become a place where life went to die. 1953 brought no relief. Martha May, now 24, pregnant again. 8th child. Sarah, 5 years old, remained frozen at infant stage, requiring constant care. Jacob, 3, had learned to navigate his blind, deaf world through touch, but his jaw meant he could only take liquids and soft foods prepared with painstaking care. Daniel arrived in March 1953. He looked like he'd been partially melted. Face asymmetrical to an extreme degree, one side drooping far lower than the other. His skull bones hadn't fused properly, soft spots pulsing visibly with each heartbeat. His breathing, a wet, gurgling sound that meant fluid in his lungs his body couldn't clear. Daniel lived 6 months. Martha May barely slept during that time, constantly monitoring his breathing, clearing his airway, trying to keep him alive through sheer will. When he finally died in September, she felt guilty relief mixed with her grief. She was exhausted past measure, running on instinct, caring for 3 severely disabled children while her body prepared to create another. The community's response to the Colliers was complicated. Christian charity demanded some assistance. Church members occasionally left food or clothing on the porch, knocking and fleeing before anyone could answer. But the visible evidence of the Collier situation bred fear and revulsion. People whispered about what happened when families got too close, when blood turned in on itself. An elderly woman named Mrs. Hester who ran the general store in Harland, finally took action. Fall 1953, she contacted a circuit-riding doctor named Coleman, who visited remote communities several times a year. She described the Collier situation in terms that finally pierced his professional detachment. He agreed to visit. Dr. Coleman arrived at the Collier cabin in November 1953. He was 56, a man who'd seen poverty, neglect, and suffering throughout his Appalachia career. Nothing prepared him for what he found in that cabin. Sarah, 5.5, lay in an infant's cradle, her body twisted and underdeveloped, her eyes tracking him with an awareness that made his skin crawl. Jacob, blind and deaf, rocked in a corner, his malformed jaw giving his face a grotesque appearance. Another child, a girl born earlier that year, sat propped against a wall, her head lolling, drool pooling on her dress. Martha May herself looked near death. 24 years old, appearing 50, skin grayish, hair thin and greasy, eyes sunken and lifeless, 7 months pregnant with her 9th child. Dr. Coleman examined each child, documenting what he found with growing horror. The pattern was unmistakable. This wasn't random bad luck or birth defects. This was systematic genetic collapse. A family that had interbred too long. He'd read about such cases in medical journals, theoretical discussions of isolated populations and genetic drift. Seeing it in person, in this dark cabin that smelled of sickness and despair, was something else entirely. He sat with Thomas and Martha May and tried to explain in simple terms. Your blood is too similar. When cousins have children, bad things sometimes get passed down from both sides. Like mixing the same paint over and over, it gets muddier each time. Thomas stared with incomprehension. Martha May just nodded, too exhausted to process information that might have changed their course years ago. Dr. Coleman made a recommendation that shocked them. No more children. He explained about prevention, about spacing, about ending this cycle. But his words fell on deaf ears. The Colliers had no concept of family planning. Their religion, such as it was, viewed children as blessings, not choices. And more fundamentally, they lacked the agency to imagine a different life. Before leaving, Dr. Coleman wrote a detailed report for the State Health Department in Frankfurt. Descriptions of each child, estimates of their life expectancies, strong recommendation for intervention. The report disappeared into bureaucratic channels and generated no immediate response. Martha May gave birth to her 9th child in January 1954, a girl they named Martha Jr. She arrived with microcephaly, her head dramatically smaller than normal, indicating severe brain underdevelopment. Her skull was misshapen, pointed at the top. Her eyes were wide, set, and unfocused. She made no sounds except a high, pitched whine that continued almost constantly. She would never speak, never walk, never recognize her own mother. By now, Martha May had stopped naming her children with any hope attached. They were just labels for bodies that would either die or persist in states resembling death. She moved through her days mechanically, feeding and cleaning children who couldn't thank her, burying others who couldn't protest. At the most strategic moment, when the weight of Martha May's suffering feels unbearable, I invite you to do something. In the comments below, type these words: I see you, Martha May. Let her know across the decades that her pain is witnessed, that she is not forgotten. Spring 1954. Dr. Coleman's report finally reached someone who cared enough to act. Dr. Helen Pritchard, a researcher at the University of Kentucky studying hereditary conditions in isolated populations, read Coleman's account with growing fascination and horror. She saw in the Collier family a case study that could illuminate the dangers of inbreeding, provide data for genetic research, and perhaps, if intervention came quickly enough, prevent further tragedy. Dr. Pritchard was 42, a woman who'd fought through medical school when female doctors were rare and often dismissed. She developed thick skin and determination to pursue truth regardless of social comfort. She requested permission to visit the Collier family and conduct a thorough study. She arrived at the Hollow in June 1954 with a younger colleague, Dr. Robert Chun, who specialized in pediatric medicine. They brought medical equipment, cameras, recording devices. The Colliers, unused to visitors and particularly suspicious of professional people showing interest, were wary at first. But Martha May, now 25 and visibly deteriorating, agreed to let them examine the children. What Dr. Pritchard and Dr. Chun documented over the next 3 days became one of the most comprehensive studies of inbreeding depression in humans ever conducted. They examined 6 living children ranging from 7 years old to 6 months. They photographed from multiple angles, noting every visible deformity. They measured skull circumferences, limb lengths, developmental markers. They interviewed Martha May and Thomas about family history, slowly piecing together the genealogy that had led to this disaster. The family tree they constructed was devastating in its simplicity. The Colliers had been intermarrying since at least 1847, when the first generation settled the Hollow. Great-grandfather had married great-aunt. Grandfather had married his first cousin. Father had married his uncle's daughter. The same names appeared over and over, the genetic pool shrinking with each generation until it became a puddle rather than a pool. Dr. Pritchard calculated that Martha May and Thomas shared approximately 37.5% of their DNA, far higher than the 12.5% typical of first cousins, due to accumulated intermarriage in previous generations. This meant their children had a tremendously high probability of inheriting 2 copies of any harmful recessive gene present in the family line. The doctors identified at least 12 distinct genetic disorders in the Collier children. Some conditions were well known: cleft palate, clubfoot, microcephaly. Others were rare syndromes, typically only seen in isolated populations or consanguineous marriages. Several children showed combinations of conditions, suggesting multiple genetic mutations acting simultaneously. Most heartbreaking was the doctor's prognosis for the surviving children. Sarah, at 7, had the physical and mental development of a 3-month-old infant. She would never walk, talk, or live independently. Jacob's blindness and deafness, combined with his jaw deformity, meant he would require total care for life. The younger children showed even more severe impairments. Dr. Chun estimated that none of the children would survive past 15, and most would die much younger. Dr. Pritchard sat with Martha May on the 3rd day of their visit. She tried to explain in clear terms what had happened. "Your children are dying because of the family marriages," she said gently. "When relatives have children together, bad genes get doubled up. Your babies are born with things wrong that can't be fixed." Martha May listened with an expression hard to read: exhaustion, resignation. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know. I've known since Sarah. I can feel it when they're growing inside me. Something's wrong from the start. But what am I supposed to do? This is my family. This is my husband. I can't just leave." And there was the heart of the tragedy. Martha May was trapped. By geography, by culture, by poverty, by religion, by love, by duty. She could no more choose to leave than she could choose to stop breathing. The Hollow was her entire world, and the rules of that world had been established long before her birth. Dr. Pritchard made recommendations to state authorities. The Collier children should be removed to specialized care facilities. Martha May should receive medical intervention to prevent future pregnancies. Thomas should get counseling about genetic dangers. The family should be relocated to a community with more diversity and less isolation. None of these recommendations were implemented. The state lacked resources and political will to intervene in a remote family's private affairs. The Colliers had committed no crime. They were poor and isolated, but not actively neglectful. Their situation was tragic but not illegal. Removing children required evidence of abuse or immediate danger, and while the children's conditions were severe, they were being fed and sheltered to the best of the family's ability. Dr. Pritchard left the Hollow in late June 1954, carrying boxes of documentation, photographs, and measurements. She published her findings in the Journal of Medical Genetics in early 1955, using pseudonyms to protect the family's identity. The article, titled "Genetic Consequences of Extended Consanguinity in an Isolated Mountain Population," became a landmark study cited for decades by researchers studying inbreeding effects. But for Martha May, the study changed nothing. She was pregnant again by fall 1954, her 10th child. Martha May Collier's 10th child was born in May 1955. Another boy, Ezekiel Through, named after the grandfather and the first dead son. He arrived with a condition that made Dr. Pritchard's documentation seem prophetic. His bones were so fragile that the birth process itself caused multiple fractures. His ribs were visible through translucent skin, bent at angles suggesting they'd broken and healed incorrectly while still in the womb. His skull was soft, collapsing slightly under even gentle pressure. Ezekiel Through lived for 18 days. During that time, Martha May held him almost constantly, afraid that setting him down would cause further injury. She fed him drops of milk with an eyedropper, watched his shallow breathing, waited for the inevitable end. When it came, she felt numb rather than grief-stricken. She'd run out of tears years ago. This child's death brought crisis in Martha May herself. 26 years old, her body had been pregnant or recovering from pregnancy for nearly 10 consecutive years. She'd carried 10 children, buried 5, and was caring for 5 severely disabled offspring who would never grow up, never leave home, never live normal lives. The physical toll was catastrophic. Her bones had weakened from repeated pregnancies and poor nutrition. Her teeth were nearly gone, making eating painful. Her uterus had begun to prolapse, causing constant pain and bleeding. August 1955. Martha May collapsed while working in the garden. Thomas found her lying in the dirt, conscious but unable to rise. He carried her inside and sent word to Mrs. Hester at the general store, who contacted Dr. Coleman. The doctor arrived 2 days later, examined Martha May, and delivered a stark assessment. Her body was shutting down. Years of malnutrition, repeated pregnancies, and the stress of caring for severely disabled children had pushed her beyond limits. Dr. Coleman insisted she be taken to the hospital in Lexington, over 100 miles away. Thomas resisted at first, the cost, the distance, the disruption. But the doctor was adamant. If she stays here, she'll be dead within a month. Martha May spent 6 weeks in the hospital. Doctors treated her for severe anemia, malnutrition, infections, and the physical damage from repeated childbirth. They also took steps to ensure she wouldn't become pregnant again, performing a procedure without fully explaining it or seeking explicit consent, a decision reflecting both the paternalism of the era and genuine concern for her survival. When Martha May returned to the Hollow in October 1955, she found that one of her children had died in her absence. Martha Jr., born with microcephaly 16 months earlier, had succumbed to pneumonia, buried next to her siblings in the growing cemetery. Martha May stood at the gravesite and felt nothing. The capacity for grief had been used up. The years that followed brought slow decline rather than dramatic events. Sarah died in 1958 at age 10, her body finally giving out after a decade of barely functioning. Jacob survived until 1961, dying at 11 from complications related to his multiple conditions. The other children followed in succession, none reaching 13. Each death was both tragedy and relief. Release from suffering for the children, reduction in overwhelming care burden for Martha May. By 1965, all of Martha May's children were dead. 10 pregnancies had produced 10 children, and all 10 had either died in infancy or childhood. The wooden crosses behind the cabin marked the entirety of her reproductive life. A decade of pregnancy and loss that had consumed her youth and destroyed her health. Thomas died in 1967 at 46. His body worn out by years of hard labor and genetic conditions that had slowly worsened throughout his life. Martha May lived on alone in the hollow for another 12 years. She never remarried, never left the mountain. Neighbors occasionally checked on her, leaving food on the porch. She was seen rarely, a ghost haunting the place where her life had unfolded and ended while she still breathed. Dr. Helen Pritchard continued her research on isolated populations and genetic diseases. She often thought about Martha May Collier, the woman whose body had become a laboratory demonstrating the cruelest mathematics of human genetics. In 1972, she published a follow-up article tracking outcomes of all 10 Collier children, providing empirical evidence of the devastating effects of sustained inbreeding over multiple generations. The article concluded with a call for public health interventions in isolated communities. Genetic counseling, education about consanguineous marriage dangers, medical support for families affected by hereditary conditions. Martha May Collier died in February 1979 at 49. Her body was found by a postal worker making rounds in the hollow. She'd been dead several days. An autopsy revealed heart failure, though the coroner noted that nearly every system in her body showed signs of advanced deterioration. She was buried in the small cemetery behind the cabin, finally joining her children. 11 crosses stood in the clearing, marking 11 lives shaped and ended by the slow violence of genetic mathematics. The cabin itself was abandoned and eventually collapsed, returning to the mountain that had isolated the Colliers for so many generations. The story of Martha May Collier and her children became a cautionary tale in medical education, used to teach genetics students about concrete consequences of inbreeding depression. Her case appeared in textbooks, always with pseudonyms, always with clinical distance, but behind the graphs and statistics and genetic diagrams was a woman who had loved, suffered, and endured more than anyone should have to bear. In the decades since Martha May's death, our understanding of genetics has advanced tremendously. We can now identify specific genes responsible for many conditions that affected her children. We can test for genetic compatibility before pregnancy. We can intervene early with medical treatments that might have saved some of her children's lives. But for Martha May, living in an isolated hollow in mid-20th century Kentucky, none of these advances came in time. Her story reminds us that genetic science isn't abstract. It plays out in real bodies, real lives, real suffering. The Collier family's tragedy wasn't inevitable. It was the result of isolation, poverty, lack of education, and cultural practices that prioritized tradition over health. Breaking these cycles requires more than scientific knowledge. It requires social change, economic opportunity, access to healthcare, and the will to reach isolated communities with resources and education. If you've watched until this point, you've witnessed one of the darkest chapters in the hidden history of inbreeding in America. If you're not yet subscribed to this channel, subscribe now, because we continue to uncover these forgotten stories that reveal the truth about genetic isolation and its devastating consequences. In the comments, I want you to write, "I watched until the end," so I can know who truly appreciates these important historical accounts. Hit the like button if this story impacted you, and share this video with someone who needs to understand the real consequences of sustained consanguinity. These stories mattered. These lives mattered. And Martha May Collier, the Appalachian mother of wrought, deserves to be remembered not as a medical curiosity, but as a woman who endured more than anyone should ever have to face.